So we're finishing up the semester. This is our last day of class, and we only got to do 2 days on Thomas Aquinas, which is kind of unfortunate. You could actually spend the whole semester just going through some of the things that we've studied in detail. We had to cut out the part about virtues and vices specifically. We did get to talk about happiness, and now we're going to talk about something that's really central to his moral theory that brings it all together, natural law. Thomas Aquinas, if you have to summarize his moral theory by giving it a sort of title, it's a natural law theory. Does that mean that's all he talks about? No, we're going to start out actually talking about the eternal law and then a couple other different kinds of law. But this is really central to his approach. And it is a religiously based system of ethics. It's theologically informed, but it's a bit different than a lot of the sort of appeals to religion that get made in ethics, especially in popular ways as we see today. And I'm going to try to draw out that contrast as we go through. So let's start actually with the eternal law. That's where Thomas starts in this question, question 91. He asks whether there's an eternal law. And eternal means what? Lasting forever, right? But eternal actually means something beyond forever. If something exists in eternity, that means that it exists at all times and places. As a matter of fact, even before time began, it would be there. And when you get down to it, if you ask Thomas, well, what's the eternal law? Ultimately, it is God. God is not something different than the law or the reason or the structure that he gives to things. So it's not like, God one day said, people are screwing around too much. I need to make a law. I'm going to make a law and it's going to stick for good because I'm God. It's not that kind of eternal law. I mean, that's a sort of popular or bowdlerized version of how things take place in the Bible anyway, but that's not how Thomas thinks they take place. There's a sort of structure within God's mind that orients everything, that understands everything to the good, which, again, for Thomas is ultimately what? God. And that's there before even the world is created. So when the world is created, Thomas thinks that other things are kind of built into it based on this. Now this is a pretty lofty idea, isn't it? We don't actually get to see the eternal law as such. Who actually fully understands the eternal law and gets to see it all the time? Who do you think? If not us, well, just God, right? But we can grasp part of it. We can't grasp, Thomas says, we can't grasp the totality of it. He says even the blessed in heaven, they don't actually see every single thing. But, they're better off than those of us who are struggling down here trying to make sense of things. So we can grasp this in part. And Thomas thinks that the distinctive way in which we human beings do this is through the natural law. So this is what is really proper to us. And if we go on to the next question, whether there is in us a natural law. Now when we think of natural laws, what do we typically associate that with? Before you came in here today, or before you actually read the reading for today, if I said, natural law, what's your first thing that comes to mind? What would you say? Pretend you haven't read any Thomas beforehand or heard any of this sort of stuff. Yeah.
Gravity.
Okay, yeah. We think of gravity as being a law of nature. Are there any other laws of nature that you could think of that would come to mind? Any of you science majors in here? No? Well, gravity will do that, right? What are we saying when we use the word gravity? What's going to happen to this? I've used this example many times. It's going to fall, right? It better fall, and if it doesn't, we think something is drastically wrong. If I just let that go and it hung in the air, you'd be looking for a string, or you'd say, it's magic, or, you know, I'm going to fall off the earth because, you know, things are no longer sticking to where they're supposed to be. Now, Thomas Aquinas thinks that the way that the universe is constructed, physical objects like this, they do have their laws that they follow. They have a certain regularity. He looks at it in kind of an anthropomorphic way that he's getting from Aristotle. He talks about these things having inclinations. But he doesn't really think that the eraser thinks to itself, okay, what do I want to do now? I really want to fall. Well, let me do that. He thinks it just sort of happens that way. But it happens that way because of the way God set things up, right? So there is natural law in that sense. Do you think we could talk about living things? Let's start with not even animals, just plants. How do they work? I mean, we're moving into planting season pretty soon. What do we do there during that? Sometimes we just go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy the plants already formed, but that's the easy way. Yeah.
I mean, you have to plant them in like the right soil. Obviously, they need like components to survive, such as like sunlight, water.
Yeah. The plants are in some way kind of like really complicated machines that take in certain inputs like carbon dioxide, water, nitrogen from the soil, sunlight, and they change things, they manufacture things. How do we start them off?
Seed?
Yeah, well, we go and buy those little seed packets. If you're a farmer, you buy big seed packets, right? You don't buy those little ones. You can buy them, sometimes seeds by the ton. And each one of those seeds ought to be more or less like the other ones. And you know, it's kind of an interesting concept. If you think about like a kernel of corn, that's a seed. And that little kernel of corn, it looks like corn in a way, doesn't it? Because it looks like the part that we like to eat. Does it look like the whole rest of it? The stalk, the little tassel on top, the roots that are down in the bottom. And yet that's somehow contained in that seed. That unfolds. That's part of its nature. And if you plant a corn plant, you don't expect a flower to come up, do you? Or turnips, or what else? A tomato plant. If you plant a tomato seed, you expect a tomato plant. You don't expect a jalapeno pepper plant or an oak tree or anything like that. You'd think something's wrong if that happened, wouldn't you? Again, nature has certain regularities that are built into it because God arranged things that way, according to Thomas Aquinas. So now let's move to animals. What's distinctive about animals that separates them from plants? Yeah.
Move from place to place a significant amount.
Yeah, I mean, plants are pretty much stuck where they are. I mean, you could say, well, what about the ones that float on the water? Well, they're floating, right? They're not actually like paddling along. And there are some plants that do things like eat insects, you know, like Venus flytraps. But it's pretty rudimentary, isn't it? Whereas, you know, take pretty low-level animals, bugs. Bugs can do an awful lot, you know? That mosquito that's bothering you, or that fly that's bothering you, that you're trying to kill, they're pretty smart, aren't they? They're pretty good at avoiding getting killed by you. And you have this big brain and all this technology that you can use, like fly swatters and, you know, raid and pick whatever else you want. And yet that little bug can just fly around and avoid your efforts to do it in. And then, you know, when you go to sleep, it can even eat off of you, the mosquito, the fly not. The fly is going to eat the stuff you leave out. That's pretty complicated. And again, where did all of this complexity, where did all this regularity come from? Thomas would say those things have their natures. They have their own sort of structure, their own sort of, you know, pursuing their ends. And that's coming from the eternal law. Like he says, all things participate somewhat in the eternal law insofar as from it being imprinted on them. So just like the corn has a certain genetic code that unfolds, you know, they call this going from the genotype to the phenotype. The genotype is just the code. The phenotype is the actual thing that you can look at, its realization. You don't expect a corn plant to turn out to look, you know, bear tomatoes. Why not? Because it has a certain structure, a certain pattern, a certain order imprinted on it. Likewise, the fly, it's going to avoid you. If it doesn't, it's a defective fly, right? The mosquito is going to bite you. At least is it the males or the females that bite? It's the females, right? Male mosquitoes don't. So if you have a female mosquito and it's not biting you, there's something wrong with it. It's made to do that. It has a nature imprinted on it. They derive their, as he says, respective inclinations. They, again, does the eraser as a physical object say to itself, it's time for me to fall now? It doesn't do that. It doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have a mind. Does the mosquito actually think to itself, what should I do today? Visit the other mosquitoes. It's an awfully nice day. Some blood could be nice. It doesn't ponder these sort of things the way we do sometimes, right? Should I go do my work now, or should I just hang out? Mosquito, you know, it desires the blood because it's actually going to use it, I think, in part of the egg production process, isn't it? I'm not quite sure. But it wants it. It has an inclination. And what is its inclination? To its proper acts and ends, to what it is that that thing does, and what it is that makes that thing, in the way that it can be, happy or content. And you know, you can think about this with plants again. Plants need certain basic conditions, don't they? And if you don't give them those basic conditions, how do they do?
They die.
Sometimes they die. Sometimes they linger for a long time. Makes you feel bad. You know, like the plant in your dorm room that your dorm room doesn't have enough light, and then the plant kind of gets all sickly and pale and starts withering up. Now, you know, you don't have to actually feel bad when it comes down to it. It's not a person. It's not even an animal. But it can't thrive. It can't attain its ends. Animals have ends. And do animals all have the same ends? Bless you. Yes.
Well, you sort of could argue that they do in one way or another, and aren't all animals basically just trying to like eat, sleep, and reproduce?
Yeah, those are some certain basic ends that you can say in general they all share. But then when you get to the level of specificity, what is it that actually consists in thriving for them? Well, think about insects, for example, again. Think about the difference between different kinds of wasps and bees. Now, again, we're not attributing sort of consciousness to them. We're not saying that they actually think about this sort of thing like they do in cartoons and talk with each other and debate the good. But there are solitary wasps, right? There are wasps that don't live in colonies. They just live by themselves. And they're basically interested in reproducing. They're sort of like machines that go out, and many of them prey on spiders. So they'll go and find a spider or a caterpillar or something like that, and they'll sting it. Usually to paralyze it, they lay their eggs in it, and then often take it back to a nest, and then the eggs hatch and they eat the other arthropod, the spider or the caterpillar or whatever. And it'll sting you. If you mess with its nest, they'll sting you, right? But they're not interested in stinging very much, are they? They're mainly interested in attaining that end of reproducing. And they're not really, it's mostly the female wasps who do things, right? It's mostly female ants and bees and wasps, all these social animals that do anything kind of interesting. The female is really only interested in the male for one thing, it's to mate, to reproduce, and then to feed its young. And if you can say that wasp is happy, that's what makes it happy. That's attaining its end. Now, what about more complicated sorts of insects? Well, think about honeybees. honeybees, what do they like to do? They're not really into stinging people either, are they? Yeah.
Collect pollen so they bring the pollen back to the hive and make honey out of it.
Yeah, and that's a pretty involved process. They fly out and they get onto flowers, and they not only want the pollen, they also like the nectar, and then they come back and they communicate with each other. They do these dances that scientists have been sort of unraveling, and they're pretty complicated. They buzz around and they say, well, there's a flower or a patch about 60 yards off this direction, and they use the sun to navigate. Pretty neat stuff. And then they make a lot of honey, and if you ever look at a bee's hive, there's all these different kinds of cells. There's different kinds of honey and different types of little cells where things are stored. And they've got 3 basic kinds. There's the queen, who, what's her job?
Reproduce.
Yeah, reproduce, lay eggs, and she's usually a little bit bigger than the other ones. And there's usually only one queen. There's another queen comes about, and she's got to take off or fight to the death with the first queen. Usually they take off. And then there's all these workers, and then there's the males, and the males basically are just there to help out with reproduction, and then they kick them out of the nest and let them die. They're called drones. We talked about somebody being a drone. Are those male bees really unhappy? No, they did their thing. They reproduced. That was their purpose. They're not, out there complaining with, picket signs. Unfair, unfair, we deserve our honey too, or anything like that. And the female worker bees, what makes them happy, insofar as bees can be happy, finding the flowers, doing all those sorts of things. Bees can feel another thing too. They can get angry, right? Like, if you ever go up to a bee's nest and shake it a bit, how's that pan out? Yeah, don't get a stick and start poking it, because what do they think you're doing? They think you're trying to break in to take their honey or kill their queen. And then they follow certain ends as well, protection. And they do certain distinctive acts. They come out, do they try to reason with you? Now, this is our hive. Maybe you didn't fully understand. Do they try to push you away? No, they do their thing. They sting you. And they actually sacrifice themselves because, bees, when they sting, it kills them to do so. Wasps are at a bit of an advantage because they don't have barbed stingers, so they can sting you over and over again. Now let's think about yellow jackets. Yellow jackets are, when you get stung in late summer, it's probably a yellow jacket. In part because yellow jackets are very aggressive. They're actually carnivorous. They're actually fairly omnivorous. They'll eat just about anything. And they tend to outstrip their food supply and get really agitated and then start devouring themselves around August, September. So things get pretty horrific inside yellow jacket nests, believe it or not. And it gets even worse, too. I found this out by chance, because I was cutting the grass and one of them came and was buzzing around me, so I knocked it away and it stung me. If they sting you, if a yellow jacket stings you, it will inject you with a poison, just like every other kind of bee, right? Or social insect. Well, that actually has a chemical in it that will cause you to produce pheromones, produce scent. And that scent tells the other yellow jackets, come here and sting this person. And so they will, and this is part of their nature, part of what makes them what they are. They'll come and they'll sting you pretty badly, and then you'll go somewhere else and you'll be like, oh, I'm okay now. And then you go to the back door and there's a whole cloud of them just hovering there, waiting for you to come out so they can sting you some more. What's going on there? Again, that has to do with the way that they're designed, and that does actually kind of fulfill an end. When it first happened to me, I was like, how do they know I'm here? Do they talk with each other? No, it's just chemical. It's just pheromones being transferred, but it does serve a kind of end. So if all these things can be built into animals, now we go to a higher level. What about us? Don't we have some sort of ends built into the fabric of our distinctive way of being? Thomas says yes. So that's where we get to the natural law. So let's look at this question now, after all that long discussion, whether there is a natural law. He says, we can say that there is a natural law, in part because, he says, all things are subject to divine providence, and they're ruled and measured by the eternal law. So all these things partake of it as they have these respective inclinations. Do we have inclinations? Do we have certain basic drives? And we're going to look at some of these in a little bit more detail. Yeah, we do have certain basic drives. Do we have certain distinctive acts, certain things that human beings do that are distinctive to us as a species? What would you say those are? Yeah.
It's like upper cognitive abilities, like being able to reason and think.
Yeah, and you know, do apes do some of that sort of stuff, or dolphins? Yeah, to some extent, but nothing like us. You know, when an ape builds a supercomputer, then maybe we'll start, you know, taking that seriously and saying, you know, when dolphins, which, you know, have this gigantic brain, most of that brain is actually devoted to sonar, it turns out. So if sonar was actually some way in which you could build technology and communicate with each other and build a whole society, maybe we take it a bit more seriously that they're sort of our rivals with this. But yeah, you're right, our cognitive abilities. What else do we do that's distinctive to us that animals don't do, except in cartoons? Yeah.
Talk and think.
Yeah, I mean, animals do communicate with each other, but their range of communication is much more limited than ours is. I mean, no animal actually asks about language. You know, animals aren't bilingual either. It's not like an animal says, you know, it's not like a dog says, I need to learn what those cats are saying over there because I think they're talking about me. I better learn some cat language. It just doesn't happen. It wouldn't occur to them to do that. So language is a key thing. What else? Are there other things that we do that are really distinctively human? These are great things. Thomas would love to hear language, rationality, cognitive abilities. But are there other things that set us apart? It's sometimes interesting to think about those too. I'll get you started. I actually brought this up in a lecture I gave up at the culinary earlier this week. We're the only animal that cooks. I mean, there are some animals that do modify their food in certain ways so that they can take it in better. You know, flies, for example, do their digestion actually in large part outside of their body, which is kind of gross, frankly speaking. But, you know, what they're doing is kind of cooking the food, but they're not actually like getting out, you know, a pot or a pan and slicing things up and mixing ingredients together and saying, how can I make this taste better? We do that, don't we? That's distinctive human behavior. I guess you could ask, could you teach a chimpanzee to cook? I suppose, you know. Maybe they could get a taste for certain things. I like ginger in this. But that's us. What else? What are other things that are just totally distinctively human?
Well, all of our things like going to school, getting married,
Oh.
traditions that
Yeah.
animals would never do.
Okay, that's a lot of stuff right there.
Yeah.
Going to school, and this ties into those cognitive abilities. We have to develop those, and that's made possible because of speech. So going to school, getting married. I mean, there are animals that do mate for life, but they don't have a ceremony for that, do they? With this ring, I thee wed, you know, my beautiful mockingbird wife, something like that. They don't do that. Yeah.
You can also say like clothing ourselves.
Yes. Bless you. And again, can you turn animals onto that sort of thing? Yeah, I mean, you could get a chimpanzee, and they're very curious, and they might like getting dressed up, but they don't actually do that in the wild, do they? We actually impose it on a lot of animals that don't like it, like cats and dogs. Cats and dogs don't really like being dressed up, but we make them do it anyway, especially when they're kids. I remember we used to shove my dog into a pair of shorts. She hated it. What was the third thing that you said? So,
I just said any like traditions that we have.
Traditions, yes, we have culture. And again, if we look at the higher apes, they do have, bands in which certain things get passed on and become kind of traditions. But I mean, that's integral to us. And humans have been doing that for a very long time. Yeah.
I was gonna say, music and religion.
Yes, religion. You don't find animals, let's say we take very sort of early types of religion, involving, say, some sort of cult with sacrifices and a statue that's supposed to represent some sort of deity. You don't find dogs doing that. You don't find lions, who are the top of their food chain, doing that. You don't find dolphins doing that. You only find human beings doing that. Only human beings bury their dead with things. Well, I mean, most animals don't even bury the dead anyway. But we very early on bury the dead with things. That shows the existence of beliefs in an afterlife, like flowers or possessions. Bury them in certain ways, like in a fetal position or in a laid out position. We are symbolic creatures. So that is part of our inclinations. These are things that children play at. These are things that are part of the fabric of who we are. It's not just our higher cognitive abilities, and those are really important. It's also these things like passing on traditions, like cooking, like religion. You could probably say we're also the only animal who truly laughs, who engages in things to try to make each other laugh. I mean, hyenas make it sound like laughter, but it's not actually laughing, even though the cartoons try to make it seem like that. So that's all, in some way, part of the fabric of who we are, of what we are, the kind of beings we are. So the natural law is going to be connected with this. And he says, among all others, the rational creature is subject to divine providence, the eternal law, in the most excellent way. How so? We actually, like Thomas says, partake of a share of providence. And again, this is a theologically informed perspective, right? Thomas sees us as being above the other animals, not just by having these greater abilities, but by being made part of the process. Having what we do made part of the process. Sort of, we get to be in the entry-level positions in the divine bureaucracy, you might say, right? Starting out in the mail or wherever else you have to start out. But we get to be parts of them. How are we provident? Both for itself, one's own being, and for others. So it says, wherefore it is a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination, its proper end and act. So our natural inclinations are not just to preserve our own lives or to make ourselves happy or something like that. They're also, provided we haven't gotten screwed up in the process, they're also for others. They're also directed towards others. That's distinctively human too. It's interesting, they've done these nature films and they've found like water buffaloes, they don't actually always abandon the one that got chased by the lions and attacked. Sometimes they'll come in and they'll attack the lions and save it. But we do that sort of thing fairly routinely. So, we do have a natural law. Now what we want to do is we want to clarify these other kinds of law that Thomas talks about. The natural law tells us to do certain things, but it's very general. So it's not like law out there, like the law that governs speeding on Route 9. It governs speeding pretty much everywhere else, right? If you speed and you get caught, you get a certain kind of ticket. It's all determined by law. It's made public. It's there to preserve the common good. Natural law is a lot more general. So then we get to what he calls human law. And this is the kind of law that we're used to thinking about. The actual determinate laws in our society. And these can be more or less well made, more or less well put together. I mean, have any of you ever run into a law that you think is unjust or unfair? Never? People, complain about laws all the time.
What do you mean, like laws, like just
by governments. Human law, where he's talking about that, these are laws actually created by some sort of governing body. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a democratic government. You could have a dictatorship, and that has its own kind of laws. The communists have their own kind of laws.
Would you count like rules or whatever set by like schools?
Yeah.
Like I know at my high school I had a really strict like uniform policy.
Okay.
So like, I mean like we all had to wear, I went to Catholic school, so we wore uniforms, but like
Yeah.
one stupid thing that we weren't allowed to do is wear earrings like bigger than a quarter. Like I don't know what that was supposed to do at all.
Yeah, how they fixed on that, yeah.
But that was one of the stupid, would that count underneath?
Yeah, and how would you measure whether that's a good law or rule or not? You would compare it to what its purposes are, and what it actually accomplishes. If the law tends to just aggravate everybody, it's probably not a good law or a good rule. Sometimes people actually create laws just so they can have power over other people, or make their lives miserable. I mean, that's not usually the case, thank God, but it happens, right? Some laws are created just to enforce inequalities. I brought up Martin Luther King a couple times this semester. Martin Luther King refers in his letter from a Birmingham jail to Thomas Aquinas, and this notion of human laws having to be tested in accordance with some sort of criteria that comes from the natural law. The law that he was talking about specifically had to do with segregation. Is it okay in a society to sort of arbitrarily set aside some people and say they cannot participate in the society, but they have to contribute to it? Does that strike you as unfair or unjust? Yes? Anybody for that? Anybody saying, inequality, yes, this is great. I want as much of it as possible, so long as I'm, not the one getting screwed over by it. If you feel that there's something wrong with that, then that would be an example of what Thomas is calling the natural law within you. You're not feeling it just because you're not, winning out in it, right? It's not a purely selfish thing. When you hear about that sort of condition, something inside you says, that's not right. And it may not just be an intellectual thing, it may be a feeling thing too. That's what Thomas calls the natural law, being used as a measure for a human law. Being able to tell you that human law is actually not serving its purpose. It's not well made. Not all human laws that we have are actually well made. I'll give you another example. The tax laws. Taxation determines what the government has to, do things that it needs to do, right? Provide for the common defense. You guys have all read the preamble of the Constitution. Assure liberty, all these sorts of things. And you guys probably have not been greatly affected, unless any of you have your own business, by tax laws and the way that we've got it set up in the United States. But you're all going to be out there in the workplace in about a year and a half. Well, a year now, actually, close to it. And then you're going to run right smack dab into it. And you'll find out it's very irrational in many respects, and it's the product of a lot of compromises between two political parties, neither of whom really represents the whole of the society very well. And they don't even represent the whole of the society very well when they do things in what we call a bipartisan way. They represent their constituents and their constituents. This is the way political parties work. They're not usually for the common good. One reason Washington didn't want to have political parties. They cautioned about that after he left office. The tax code might be an example of something where you would want to look at the natural law and think about what actually strikes one as fair. Maybe there are some people who get off too easy, and there are some people who have too great of a burden. These are things that you can discuss and debate about. And if all you have is the human law, then it's pretty much whatever the person in power says goes. That's might makes right again, right? You have to have some sort of standards by which to judge whether the human laws have been well put together or not, or even rules or policies or things like that. Now, we also do need the human laws, though. Because the natural law is, again, it's general. It doesn't cover every sort of case. We do have to, in each society, in each, even schools and groups, we have to sit down and we have to make rules, because otherwise we can't, again, fulfill some of our ends. One of our big ends is actually living together without killing each other, or oppressing each other, or, you know, making it impossible for us to cooperate. So the laws do that. I'm going to read you a few other passages where he's talking about the human laws and natural law. He says, he's talking about the practical reason. How do we figure out what we ought to do? He says, on the part of the practical reason, each human being has a natural participation in the eternal law according to general principles, but not as regards the particular determinations of individual cases. Those are contained in the eternal law because, you know, God knows everything and, you know, set everything up and all that. So in a certain way, the human laws, if they're designed well, also participate in the eternal law. And that's a good segue for moving into this issue. Thomas talks about a divine law as well. And here's where it gets a little bit sticky. You know, oftentimes when we talk about not mixing religion and morality, the great fear that people have is somebody's just going to get out the Bible or the Quran and start quoting some verses and saying, see, there you go. We don't need to think about this anymore. We're all done. That's what we call the divine command theory. You know, thus saith the Lord, now shut up and do it. That's not what Thomas is advocating. But what he's talking about as divine law might strike you at first as being along those lines. So I do want to talk about that in its relationship to the natural law. He asked this question, was there a need for a divine law? And that's a good question to ask. Because, you know, the picture that we've put out so far, you've got a God. Let's say, you know, just put aside the question of whether God exists or not. Let's just say we're accepting Thomas's views. There is a God. He's, you know, the sort of God that Christians, Jews, Muslims describe him as, you know, created everything out of nothing, structures everything, cares about the creation, that, you know, he's not sort of a capricious God, made things just to break them or anything. He actually cares about what's going on. And he gave human beings reason and certain inclinations so that they could figure things out. Well, then why would you need something else? Why wouldn't the natural law be enough? And he says, well, the natural law isn't enough for a couple reasons. So he says, besides the natural and human law, it was necessary for the directing of human conduct to have a divine law. And this for 4 reasons. What are these reasons? Well, he says, first, it's by law that human beings are directed how to perform their proper acts in view of their last end. So let's say we put that into more contemporary language. In order to figure out what's going to make you truly happy, you have to do what's right. You have to actually follow, what's going to satisfy your inclinations and attain your ends. Now, remember back to last class. As the sort of creatures that we are for Thomas, is our last end, is our final end, is what's going to make us fully happy something in the world, or not? What did Thomas say? Yeah.
No, because it's God.
Yeah, so any created good, it could be part of happiness, but it's not going to be the whole thing. The natural law will help us to attain happiness here. For instance, the natural law will tell us you need to get along with other people. If you're not actually getting along with other people, you're probably not going to be very happy, right? Even if happiness for you just consists in pleasure, you're probably not going to enjoy a lot of pleasure because people are going to want to take it away from you because you're irritating them, right? So the natural law will help you out with some things. But it won't actually direct you to the ultimate end. So a divine law is needed for that. So that's one reason. The second reason, he says, the uncertainty of human judgment, especially on contingent and particular matters. As we get away from the more general to the more and more particular, we can go wrong a lot easier. And it's not just because, you know, we're fallible human beings or something like that. It's because particular things are actually harder to judge. It's really easy to, and think about math classes, right? All of you remember having problems and learning how to do certain things. And what were the kind of problems that always bothered, well, not necessarily all of you, but most of you the most? What were the kind of problems that you didn't like to do? Yeah.
The long division problems.
Oh, really? Well, that was the one that bothered you the most. I had all sorts of irrational things myself. Like, I didn't like, you know, ending up with a negative answer, but that was kind of a weird quirk on my part. What do people complain about in math class, though? And worry about running into on tests? What kind of problems? Yeah.
Fractions.
Wow.
Yeah, we were there.
Fractions? Well, I guess fractions are hard to deal with. What is it? Word problems. Yeah. Why do people dread word problems? Yeah.
Because you can interpret what they're asking in so many different ways, depending on how things are worded.
Word problems are sometimes ambiguous, aren't they? They, like you said, they can be interpreted in multiple ways. I suppose fractions and long division, you know, it's possible to get things wrong in it because they're more complicated ideas, right? And that's sort of along these lines. But it's not quite the same thing as things being ambiguous. If your teacher writes word problems badly, you can't figure out how to solve them, can you? And there's certain situations when we get away from the very general and we start getting into the nitty-gritty. Thomas has a great example a little bit later on when in our question 94. He's talking about giving back something in return. This is a classic problem. In general, if somebody gives something to you and says, hold on to this for me, when they ask you for it, you should give them the thing back, right? Like, you know, a weapon, for example. What if they say, I'm going to need my gun back because I want to go in and shoot up my workplace? Should you give them the gun?
No.
Now, you notice you're sort of going against the general rule that you always ought to return what's given to you, right? So, now, your inclination is right, though, Thomas says. It would be the wrong thing to do. Why? Because there are certain particulars involved, and you have to be able to look at those particulars. So, human law sometimes screws it up, doesn't it? It would be helpful on certain matters, particularly very murky matters, to have some divine help, wouldn't it? To have some sort of, statement from above. Okay, here's what we need to do in this sort of situation. Think about, Thomas doesn't use this example here, but this is a great example. Should you forgive people who harm you? One of the distinctive things that you find in Christian thought is this emphasis on forgiveness. Not every religion preaches that too, by the way, or preaches it to the same extent. And not every moral theory would necessarily go along with that. You know, if you're a utilitarian, there could be some good purpose behind forgiveness, you know, it could serve some general happiness thing, but not necessarily. Maybe it's better to, when people screw up, you come down hard on them. And if they cross you, maybe it's better that you, cause them some pain so they'll, return more pleasure later. The divine law stressed forgiveness over and over and over and over again. Even, by the way, that's not something unique to Christianity. If you look at the Jewish scriptures, before the New Testament, you will find injunctions to forgive. You'll find it even in the Jewish law, but less of an emphasis on it. How would we know that that's really something that the natural law requires of us if something didn't come along to clarify that for us? That's one of the purposes of the divine law, to give a little bit of clarification on these particulars. He says, here's the third one. Human beings can make laws in those matters of which we're competent to judge. Now, what do we actually get to see about another person? Why is it that you might not know people as well as that you think you do? You you might be surprised by their good behavior or their bad behavior. Yeah.
But you can't really like tell what they're thinking or what they really feel all the time.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell a little bit about what they're
But you can't be
thinking.
like in their mind.
Yeah. Thomas puts it in terms of you can't know another person's heart, but who can? Again, in this sort of theological schema, God. So Thomas talks about interior dispositions in addition to actions. He says, human beings are not competent to judge of interior movements that are hidden, but only of exterior acts which appear. We get to see the outsides of other people. And you can actually, start to infer some things about them after a while, right? If somebody screws you over each time that you deal with them, or you get into a conversation with them, and every time you're in a conversation they try to one-up you, you can figure out after a while that you don't want to hang out with that person and that there's something wrong inside of them, right? It's not just a bunch of exterior acts. But do you really know what's going on with them? You can't like open up their head and look inside and see what's going on, can you? You can't peer into their soul. So the divine law, he says, human laws can only look at exterior things. Did you follow the law or didn't you? They can even, if somebody's dumb enough to say, I didn't follow the law because I hate the law, they can, judge some interior things then. But for the most part, they can't. So the divine law comes along, and the divine law, like he says, can tell us about what we need to do in order to have virtue, because it knows human beings a bit better than these do. In part because it's coming sort of from God, in a more direct way than the natural law, which is built into our nature. We use reason to understand. So again, you think about the example of forgiveness. Aristotle said you should get angry at some times, right? And yeah, you can forgive some people, but if you actually read Aristotle carefully, he'll say, there's a lot of cases where you shouldn't forgive people. As a matter of fact, you're doing the right thing by not forgiving bad people. What does Christianity teach? Yeah, you should even pray for your enemies. Now that's a weird thing to say. You should pray for people who hate you. You should wish them well, even knowing that they're probably going to remain complete bastards, and still try to get you and all that. I mean, it's pretty tough stuff to hear, isn't it? Do you think the natural law would tell you that? Would you, sitting by yourself or in some determinate situation, using the reason that you've been given, come to the conclusion that, yeah, that person is mean to me, but instead of being mean to them, which is what one of my inclinations would be, my natural inclination, right? Somebody's mean to you, don't you want to be mean to them? I know I do. The divine law comes along and says, you should forgive. And not only should you do it this time, you should do it at other times, because that's going to build up the kind of habit within you that'll make you a happier person and a better person. And it may not even change that other person, too. They may continue to do what they do. That's not really your concern. The divine law will come along and help you towards certain kinds of virtues that the natural law by itself wouldn't get you to. The fourth one he says, bless you, human law cannot punish or forbid all evil deeds. Why not? Well, when you try to do away with all evils, you also end up doing away with a lot of goods, too. Human law is kind of a blunt instrument. It's difficult to write laws well so that they'll actually attack what's wrong, what's bad, and not also screw some things up that are good, too. And I think you can probably think of some examples. When do we usually make laws or rules? Forbidding something, yeah.
Usually after the problem has occurred.
Yeah. Trying to think of a good example. The thing that came to mind immediately was DUIs and drunk driving. That's maybe not the best example, but let's look at it and we'll see if we can think of another example like that. When I was a kid, you could drink a lot and drive. I don't mean like a kid like, high school kid or something like that, because they already started to pass laws then. But there wasn't that recognition that it was really dangerous to let people get on the road all liquored up. And I grew up in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin is a pretty hard drinking state, and it was even more hard drinking back then. It actually leads the nation still in brandy consumption. It's pretty close to being on top of beer consumption, believe it or not. And people were getting in a lot of accidents. And so then, what did they do? They passed laws. Because, there were some people who would just get out of the bar after drinking, the whole night, totally drunk, and then drive home, right? And nobody really thought much about it, just try not to hit anything. But they did hit things. And so then, there were pushes, we need to have a law about this. And predictably enough, the laws were very sweeping, and they came down pretty hard. And it did curb a lot of the drunk driving. There's still some problems with it, right? You can't completely eliminate people's bad behavior, but you can make it a lot smaller. Did that have any bad effects? Now it's, I think, 0.08 in most states. Is that what it is in New York? Does anybody know? Yeah. How much do you have to drink to blow 0.08? Not very much, right? And it does have a good effect in that, it keeps people from being, very drunk and then driving, because, if you had just more than a few drinks, you're going to blow way over that. But does it make a lot of people who actually are not prone to drunk driving worried or reluctant to engage in social occasions? Does it keep people, I know people who will sometimes say, I'm not going to go to that because, I would probably have 3 glasses of wine because I'd be there for a while, and then, you got to find somebody else to drive me home. And that seems a little strange, doesn't it? But people actually do that. That's an example, not a very great example, but that's an example where the law, which is trying to curb some sort of evil, actually roots out some goods as well, like, conviviality. Can you think of any other rules where, somebody had to clamp down and it screwed things up for everybody else? Yeah.
Well, what they're trying to do now, they're trying to pass a law so that we don't have the right to bear arms anymore.
Oh, yeah.
If they do
Okay.
pass it, then that's making law much vulnerable to the people who don't abide by that law.
Yeah, this is a long-standing debate. This has been going on for several generations where, there is a genuine problem with people shooting each other in this country. We have a much higher rate than some other civilized countries, other liberal democracies that are sort of on the scale of development that we are. And so there's a lot of, provisions to try to pass what we call this gun control, right? And within most major cities, you can't walk around with, all sorts of guns. If you do, you're generally probably a criminal, or you're an authorized, person like a police officer or something like that. Yeah, there are proposals to ban handguns altogether. Let's say we stick with handguns. Don't complicate it by bringing hunting rifles and all that. And we don't complicate it either by saying automatic weapons, because I don't think anybody's actually in favor of anybody can have any automatic weapon they want, right? Those are federally licensed. So we're just talking about handguns. You can pass laws that totally ban all handguns. We could do this for the whole nation if we wanted to. It'd be very tough to enforce, but it could be done. Would that rule out certain goods? In this case, we actually do have a constitutional right in which that would infringe. And that would, just by itself, taking away people's constitutional rights causes all sorts of social discord. And that's a bad. That's taking away a good thing, right? You could also make, arguments that people do, like, well, if you do that, then the only people that are actually going to have guns are going to be the people who don't follow the law, and then some people can't protect themselves. And there are cases where people do legitimately protect themselves with handguns, right? And we could look in the newspapers or magazines and find something. So the law can be a bit heavy-handed with respect to that. does that mean that we shouldn't have any laws altogether? Because sometimes laws have unintended consequences? No, and we would actually still have to do sort of a balancing thing there. We'd have to decide, well, does the evil that is being prevented outweigh the collateral damage that's coming with it? If it does, then maybe we still pass the law anyway, like we did with the drunk driving laws, because the collateral damage is pretty small compared to the evil that we're preventing. But the gun control is a little bit tougher, I think. The arguments are a lot more complicated, aren't they? Now, I don't think the divine law tells you much about gun control, frankly. I mean, some people may adduce Bible passages to try to make an argument about gun control, but I think there's probably going to be some troubles with that. But there are plenty of things that the divine law, over time, did tell people that were wrong, that they didn't seem to be getting, and because the Bible, came to them and people were actually following it, they realized it wasn't good. I'll give you an example, actually, out of St. Anselm that you may find kind of funny. He wrote a king of Ireland while he was Archbishop of Canterbury. So he's a bishop. He's in charge of teaching about the faith. He's in charge of teaching about the divine law. And archbishops are pretty high up, so they can call kings on the carpet. So he writes this guy. I think his name is Muirtot, and he tells him, "Hey, I've heard about something that's going on over there, and you shouldn't be doing it. I know it's a lot of fun for you, but I don't think that you should be doing it. And you're the king, so you should probably make sure that this isn't happening." What he's complaining about, I don't know if this was actually historically the case or not, he says, "You guys are swapping your wives. You're trading them out with each other, just like people getting off of one horse and onto another. And that's not right." And then he says to him, here's where the divine law would come in. I mean, the natural law would tell you that's not a good idea too, but sometimes we don't get the natural law. He tells him, if you want to know you're not supposed to do that, you can either read the scriptures or have somebody else read them to you. And that's how he talks to this king. That would be an example of something where the divine law is being very clear about, look, this just can't go. This is something that's bad for you, it's bad for them, it's bad for your subjects. You didn't seem to get it with the natural laws. As a matter of fact, your human law that you're enacting over there in Ireland seems to say this is A-OK. So then the divine law has to come in and clarify things. So Thomas does think that there is a need for a divine law. One thing I do want to point out, right before we finish up with this part, these are going to be saying more or less the same thing. This is going to be a bit more specific in certain things. And the natural law can get murky for us because we often tend to be disordered in our desires and things. We're not 100% whole and rational all the time. So the divine law, think of it as sort of like a support system for the natural law. But where is Thomas really putting his attention? It's primarily in the natural law. Because if you're functioning well, the things that are being talked about in the Bible, like, think about the Ten Commandments. What are some of the Ten Commandments that have to do with what you ought to do with other people? Yeah, don't murder anybody, right? Well, you didn't, if you didn't get that, if like things weren't working for you right, or your society said, kill anybody you like, so long as they don't matter, then it would be good to have the Bible to come along and say, don't kill anybody, don't murder people. But you could actually just consult the natural law and figure that out, couldn't you? If you're being honest with yourself, your conscience could convict you even if you didn't have some sort of religious authority, because they're telling the same thing. What's another one? Yeah, and adultery. How would we sort of reconceive that now? Don't cheat in relationships. Don't seduce anybody else out of their relationship. And again, do you need the Bible to actually tell you that? I mean, if you do, you're pretty hard up, right? If that's the only reason why you're not going out and sleeping with, other people's spouses, then you really do need the divine law. But, if you think about it and you think, boy, this is not a smart thing to do. This is actually hurting people. This is damaging relationships. This is not good for me over time. You would be using the natural law. You could figure that out on your own, Thomas thinks. Let's think about one of the other ones. Don't steal. Again, if things were screwed up for you and somebody came up to you and says, look, it says here in the Bible, don't steal. And it doesn't just say it here, it says it in a whole bunch of other places too. And that kept you from stealing, that would be good, right? But could you figure that out on your own? I think you probably could, and Thomas thinks that you could too, because that's part of the natural law as well. So, what I want to talk about now is this weird word that he calls the fomes, all right? That's a kind of law, and this is in Article 6 of question 91, whether there's a law in the fomes of sin. And why do we have this weird word? Because nobody's quite sure how to translate it well, frankly. And I don't know how to translate it well to make sense, so we'll just call it that. And it's basically something like, for us, following our pure animality, detached from reason, when reason has become defective. And so he says, when he's considering this, everything participates in the eternal law. Even the instincts that animals have participate in the eternal law. So he says, under the divine lawgiver, various creatures have various natural inclinations. So what is, as it were, a law for one is against the law for another. And he uses the example of a dog and a sheep or other meek animal. And he talks about fierceness. Now, forget little lap dogs or stuff like that. Most dogs are pretty fierce, right? I used the example a little bit earlier. Take a stick, poke a dog with it. They'll bite that stick, won't they? Now, go ahead and do that to a sheep, and you won't get quite the same reaction. It'll run away. It's got different sets of instincts, doesn't it? And each animal has built into it a set of basic instincts that make it what it is, that produce the behavior that's characteristic of it. So, think about a lion. What are some of the typical lion behaviors that you'd associate with them?
Eating other animals.
Yeah, I mean, lions are not vegetarians. You can try to make them vegetarians, but it's not going to work because they're designed, bless you, they're designed to do that. Let's say we take a herbivorous animal like a horse. Can you feed a horse meat? I suppose you could, but you'd screw up the horse as a result. I mean, there are legendary things that, I don't know if there's any basis to this whatsoever, but there's some legends about people feeding horses meat. How do lions behave? How do they get their meat?
Ferocious.
Yeah, they are. I mean, go and start messing with a lion, and the horse will probably take off. I mean, the horse knows you're a predator right off the bat. This is one of the things they teach you in horse training, to be aware of the fact that the horse, by looking at you, you've got eyes in the front of your head, that means you're a predator. You're coming towards it, you're big and tall, you're a predator. It'll take off. That's a natural instinct in it. What about a lion? Approach a lion in the wild. Probably not a good idea,
Thanks
right?
for violating its territory.
Yeah, well, they are territorial. Horses actually can sometimes have territorial things. How do lions live together? Yeah, pride. Pack is sort of a general. No, it's okay. It's a general term. We have all sorts of crazy things like crows are a murderer, and wolves, dogs are in packs. I guess cats are all in prides, maybe, if you have a whole bunch of house cats together. I don't know. Flock of sheep, right? Do you guys know how it works in the lion world? It's actually kind of brutal. There's like one top lion, the male lion, and then there may be a few younger ones with him, fairly rare. And then there's the females. Who actually does most of the hunting? Females, yeah. And then there's all these cubs. And think of the males as basically like being tanks, like the armored vehicles, with the guns on them, kind of unwieldy. They're not doing a lot of the hunting because they're so massive. They can't chase things down quite as well as the females can. But the males are really good at fighting one kind of thing in particular. You know what it is? What's that? No, lions, when you put lions and tigers together, tigers are a lot bigger than lions. They whip them pretty badly. But luckily they don't occupy the same territory, yeah.
Each other?
Other male lions. Because you'll have rogue males who come in and they want to take over the pride. And if they succeed, one thing that they're going to do is kill every one of the cubs. It's just part of their nature. That, part of reproduction and passing on their genetic heritage. And the females will often, if the rogue male comes in and defeats the main male, he'll often get killed in the process. Sometimes the females will get killed in the process, defending the cubs. They can be pretty bloody. Actually, lions are like us. They're one of the animals that engages in the most intraspecies predation, where it's lions killing lions. Another animal that is sort of up there with us like that, believe it or not, chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are so aggressive towards other chimpanzees that they will actually make strategic decisions to go and hunt down another group of chimpanzees and wipe them out. They're so much like us. We are unique, really, in that respect. Not everything that's unique about us is necessarily good. Right? It's part of why the natural law is so important, to keep those sort of things in check. Now, so animals all have their own particular natures, and they all have their sort of law. And Thomas says the law of man, which by the divine ordinance is allotted to him, according to his proper natural condition, is that he should act in accordance with reason. That's what it is to follow natural law, to use the faculty of reason that's been given to us. What happens if we don't use the faculty of reason? Well, we are animals. We do still remain animal. We still have the same sort of drives that other animals do. And so he says, this very inclination of sensuality, what he means by sensuality is our animal nature. What are the things that we have basic drives towards, that we desire? We want food, we want shelter, we want security, we want sex, we want power. Now we start to get more distinctively human things. We want to be on top, we want to win, we want to attack things that make us afraid or run away from them. And if reason isn't calling the shots, then we revert to our animal nature. But our animal nature isn't really like the other animals. In some respects, we're worse. When we become just mere animals, we're way worse than any mere animal. Because the animal's got its own sort of regulatory system. Its nature that was built into it. I mean, sometimes they'll outstrip their territories. Rabbits go to Australia and eat too much of the grass, and then you have a rabbit problem, because there weren't rabbits there before. And then you find something else that preys on them, and then they get brought back into check. What about us? If we don't control our desires, we're much more dangerous than any other kind of animal. Not just to the other animals, but to each other. We can think of all sorts of ways to hurt each other that animals never devised. Sometimes we actually look at the other animals and we're like, that's not a bad idea. You hurt somebody that way. That's what, all you have to do is scan on the internet a little bit and run across all sorts of examples of that. We can come up with all sorts of ways in which we go wrong. When we don't follow the natural law, then we're stuck with these sort of disordered desires that we have within ourselves. Yeah?
So is fomes like kind of once you let your animal nature take over you, you start using reason to fulfill those animal desires rather
Yes,
than
that's-
it's just that instinct.
That's another good point. When we talked about this with Plato, right? You can have your appetites, and you have reason, and there's that third part, we'll leave that out of the process right now. And when you're properly functioning, reason is calling the shots, and it's telling the appetites, hey, you get to indulge yourself, but only this much. Because the appetites are saying, I want this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And if the appetites are calling the shots, and this is again why we're so dangerous, when our appetites are calling the shots, we don't stop the way other animals would. You know, dogs don't actually go into murderous rages and then hunt down the families of other dogs who cross them. Human beings do. Sometimes they're not even in a murderous rage. Sometimes it's just business. You know, got to eliminate the competition. Criminal enterprises do that sort of thing. So yeah, reason can become subordinated in the human being to our basic desires. And I want to hit on why Thomas thinks sometimes we can go wrong with this sort of thing. And he talks about this a little bit later on in question 94, where he's talking about the natural law. And he's dealing with questions like, is the natural law always working inside of us? You know, if we've got these inclinations, how do we actually go bad? How is it that we end up, you know, lapsing into this sort of thing? And he says, when it comes to the practical reason, how we figure out what we ought to do, what's the good thing, what our course of action ought to be. We don't always know what we ought to do. Sometimes our practical reason can be defective. It cannot actually lead us to what it's supposed to do. What can actually screw us up with these sort of things? He says there can be certain obstacles that arise. Some of these could be in terms of knowledge. So what keeps you from knowing what the good is? He says, well, your reason could be perverted by passion, by the emotional part of it. So again, think of the person who's got a vicious disposition with respect to anger. And now they're off the handle. Somebody made them angry. You better look out for them, right? Because the natural law is in them, but they're not listening to it, are they? They're listening instead to what it is that their emotions are telling them. People can ignore reason because of grief too, or just because of the desire for pleasure, or a number of other things. An evil habit. What are evil habits? Those are the vices. So if you are intemperate, if you characteristically are self-indulgent, you're always seeking to have your sensual desires satisfied. Think about some of the things that would lead you to do in contrary to the natural law. Would you stop with seconds or thirds if it's with respect to food? Even though the natural law probably tell you, hey, that's enough food for you. Leave something for everybody else. Right? No, it's a bad habit. Or an evil disposition of nature. That means there are cases where somebody's screwed up. We talked about addiction as an example of that before. Another thing that Thomas talks about as well is he talks about the natural law being able to be blotted out from the human heart, sort of in a way of being made inactive, by vicious customs. So if you grow up in a society where people are, for the most part, screwed up, you're going to have a much harder time actually listening to the natural law. So he uses this example. We don't know that it was actually true, but the ancient Romans thought that this was the case, that the ancient Germans thought that theft was okay. So long as you got away with it, it was fine. And everybody else pretty much thought it was a bad idea. The natural law says don't steal other people's property, right? Well, let's assume that was actually the case. That you have a society in which theft is considered okay so long as you get away with it, or so long as you can, fight off the person that you're stealing things from. How would you then look at those sort of matters? Would you think to yourself, well, I know that this is what my society is teaching me, but I know that that's not the right way. It'd be kind of tough to do that, wouldn't it? If everybody else around you is practicing this and you're seeing examples of it all the time, it might be hard to actually listen to the natural law then. Yeah.
Is that where divine law comes in place then? I guess
It
to
could,
assist
yeah.
that person?
Yeah, it could be very useful for that reason.
Okay.
Think about some other examples. Some more seemingly innocuous examples. Americans are workaholics compared to other societies. We tend to put in a lot more hours and put up with a lot more sacrifices than do other people. There's some good things about that, aren't there? I mean, we're also pretty productive and we generate a lot of wealth and stuff in the process. But do people make bad decisions when they're balancing work against other goods? You see people doing that? And where do they make those sort of bad decisions? What are some of the other goods they trade off against that? Yeah.
Family life?
That's probably the biggest one. And family life has to do with obligations that you actually have to other people. If you marry somebody and you make some kids with them, that's not a morally neutral thing for somebody like Thomas Aquinas. You're actually incurring some pretty important obligations. As a matter of fact, that's part of the natural laws we're going to see in just a minute. So if you're taking work, which is a good thing, again, I don't want to say, Thomas is saying be lazy, or, let's all be a bunch of communists or anything like that, and pool everything. He thinks that work is a good thing, but it ought to be balanced against these other very important goods. And the natural law could tell you that. Now, if you belong to a society which is constantly telling you, you are your job, how easy is it for you to say no? No, my spouse needs me to be home. I have to watch the kids. I need to spend some more time with my kids. Is it easy to do that? And that is an inclination, but following that inclination is pretty tough, isn't it? If you grow up in a household where your parents didn't make the time for your activities, or came home so burnt out from work that they couldn't take an interest in your activities, is it going to be harder for you to do that for your kids? It will be a bit harder, yeah. I mean, not insurmountable, right? And sometimes we actually have the counter reaction. We say, "God, this is awful. I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to force that on my kids." That's easy to say, though, because oftentimes, we have an intention. Following through on it is a different matter. We often do end up looking an awful lot like our parents. So there are some things that could end up, you might say, deactivating or suspending the natural law, making it so that it can't get the traction that it needs. It can't actually steer us in the ways that we want it to. And that, if we're not following this, we're going to be following this, because this is part of us as well, our fallen nature. And like you asked, yeah, divine law comes along and helps out with those sorts of things. By the way, there's really not much in divine law that Thomas thinks if you were functioning at top capacity, you couldn't figure out using the natural law. So there's nothing, say, that Scripture is teaching, or very little things that Scripture is teaching, that if you actually applied your reason and your reason didn't have all these impediments, you couldn't figure out on your own. Point of fact, we're usually screwed up, though, aren't we? So that's why the divine law is needed for some things. Let's now look at what does the natural law actually teach then. So we've got a lot of sort of vague, this and that about it. Let's look at Article 2. The precepts of the natural law are to the practical reason, what the first principles of demonstrations are to the speculative reason. They're self-evident principles. Now that doesn't mean that we all are aware of them all the time, but they're things, that are very general. They cover a lot of situations. Speculative reason, it would be things like the whole is greater than the parts. I mean, does anybody need that proved to them? A house is more than the door. You all get that, right? That's self-evident. When we get to particular examples, it starts to get a little bit sticky sometimes. There we're moving from the general to the particular. Now he says that practical reason works that way too. There's certain rules or commands or ideas that are so fundamental, so basic, and when you say them, they almost sound like common sense. But they're sometimes easy to deviate from as well. So he says a certain order is to be found in those things that are apprehended universally. What do we apprehend? What do we take in universally? Well, everything that you're looking at has being. It's real. It has existence. So the notion of this is included in all things, whatever a person apprehends. He says, so as being is the first thing that falls under the apprehension, so good is the first thing that falls under the apprehension of your practical reason. Good is the broadest category. There's a lot of different ways in which things can be good. We've looked at that a lot this semester, right? So, the practical reason is directed to action, to doing things, to what you ought to do. And it's directed towards ends. So the first principle of practical reason, he says, is good is that which all things seek after. The first precept of the natural law is good is to be done and where is that? Oh, done and pursued. Evil is to be avoided. That's pretty general, right? That covers an awful lot of ground. That doesn't give you an awful lot of concrete guidance and things, does it? But that's something that's built into the fabric of your thinking. That can be turned off, though. When somebody actually chooses to do something and they say, I know this is wrong, but I want to do it because I want to do what's wrong. They would be actually going against this, the highest principle of practical reason. Kind of tough to do. Usually when somebody does something like that, they're really seeking some other good. I'd like to do this because I like screwing people over. Well, then you like screwing people over, and that's what you're viewing as a good. Probably because you derive security from it, or power, or pleasure, or something like that. Now, this is really vague, though, isn't it? It's almost, I've used this example before. Does anybody know Google's ethics thing that they would always say? Don't be evil. Now, does that tell you an awful lot?
No.
Don't be evil.
I had an interview with a company last week, and they asked me if the rules out there strict no asshole policy.
What did you say?
I said I didn't know about it, but I'm all for it. I mean, it's,
The trouble becomes, how do you define it, though, right? What's that?
No asshole.
Well, there may be some paradoxes involved with
That's
that.
understandable.
It all depends on how you define the terms, doesn't it? And when it comes to good and evil, it's really a matter of specification. So we need something a bit more concrete than that. So Thomas says, okay, well, let's look now, then, not just at being as a whole, let's look at human beings. What are our different levels? What are the different dimensions of human being? And he says, all those things to which man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reason as being good in some way, and consequently as objects of pursuit, their contraries as evil and objects of avoidance. What is it that we're naturally inclined to? Well, let's start with the broadest thing. What do we share in common with all other beings? He says, there's first of all an inclination to good in accordance with the nature which you and I have in common with all other substance? What is it that all beings try to do? Besides fulfill their end and that. What's one thing that you could say they all have in common?
Enjoy life.
Not everything necessarily enjoys. That is, if plants enjoy things, they enjoy them in a very different way than we do. But let's think about plants. What do they do?
And survive. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes.
Okay.
All things attempt to continue in being. So, we have to make bigger things here. All things, like he says, desire or seek the preservation of their own being according to their nature. So, the nature of this iPhone is just a piece of technology, but, it does report when something gets screwed up on it. That's not much of an inclination, in any sort of sense. This actually does hold together as an object. It's plastic. Actually it may hold together longer than I do, because plastic is hard to break down, it turns out. This chalk, generally stays together until I wipe it on the board. Plants, more complex things, react to their environment. Turn towards the sun, the source of nourishment. They can't move from place to place, which makes them kind of vulnerable, right? Animals move from place to place, most of them. There's oysters, they stay there for the most part, but most animals move from place to place and seek their food and things like that. They try to continue in being. Don't we do that too? Don't we do a lot of things for the sake of survival? Yeah. What else? Now let's move to a higher level. What do animals do? And plants do this too, in a certain way. iPhones don't do it, and pieces of chalk don't do it. What do they do? Yeah. Very good. Plants do this. Right? They have ovum and pollen, and they do sexual reproduction in some kind of interesting way. Flowers, by the way, are the sex parts of plants. If you think about it, might turn you off from flowers. I don't know.
They're actually a particular part too.
What's that?
They're actually a particular part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And petals are actually adapted leaves. And other animals reproduce. Some of them reproduce in kind of weird ways, like earthworms, I guess, can change their sacs, and they basically just rub against each other. Insects do all sorts of kind of interesting things. Some of them, only exist for the purpose of mating. Like bees, male bees in the hive. The only purpose they have is to mate with the queen, and then after that they kick them out, and the male bees seem to be okay with it, because that's their inclination. What do some animals do that goes beyond just making babies? You get to higher animals. What do they start doing?
So like taking care of their babies or whatever it is they had.
Yeah. Now, they don't all do this. Alligators will eat other baby alligators. Apparently a mother alligator will defend the nest to a certain extent, but sometimes they just bury the eggs and take off, and that's it. If they run into their babies, they eat them off. But alligators are kind of low on the level. They're reptiles. Mammals are pretty unique. Our adaptation is making milk, and why do you need to make milk? Well, because babies need milk, and it's a way of passing on nutrients. And do all mammals then continue to take care of their babies? No, as a matter of fact, some of them will try to kill them too, like tomcats. You want to keep the tomcat away from the kittens because they'll try to kill the kittens too. But the higher you get up, the more and more caregiving there is. Yeah.
Well, like dolphins, like they don't. It's not just the parents. It's
Yeah.
like their whole pack, I guess, or whatever you call
Yeah, and the same
how
thing.
dolphins travel. It's interesting, like how they all participate in it.
Yeah. Is there a school of dolphins? I don't know.
I think,
School of
yeah,
fish.
that's what fish are referred to, probably like.
Oh no, a
school
pod.
stuff.
Because whales
Pod,
are
really?
a pod. What is it?
I've heard Gam.
A gam? Could be.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Like gammon dolphins.
Yeah, you know, I mean, you see this with some apes too. I mean, one thing about chimpanzees, they are pretty brutal creatures, much more brutal than gorillas. You know, I mean, the gorillas really get a bad rap. You know, you watch those Planet of the Apes, it's the gorillas that are the mean ones. They got it completely backwards. The chimpanzees are the ones who, you know, want to kill each other. But they will take care of others young. And you know, it's really interesting. If you look at between species, animals will actually sometimes adopt babies, not even of their species.
There was actually that special those lions who adopted a baby in Holland.
Yeah, I saw that. And everyone's waiting. When is she going to eat it?
Yeah. and
Wait,
then
what?
There was another one where a leopard adopted a baby baboon African waste one.
Yeah. What's interesting is a lot of these animals, it turns out that their instincts are a little bit less hardwired and more needing things to happen in their environment than we thought. You know, one of the shows that I used to watch with my daughter that I really enjoyed was they would do these animal rescues of these rhinos and hippos and elephants and animals like that, wild animals, and who lost their mothers and, you know, were outside of any sort of pack or pride or anything like that. And they'd bring them into an enclosure, and then quite often they'd pair them up with another animal of a different species who was also a young. And eventually they'd start to play together. So you would think elephants would only play with other elephants, but actually elephants will play with rhinos, or will play with, you know, apes or things like that. They will bond with each other. There have actually been cases with older animals having pets, at least, you know, with gorillas, like having kittens. Now that's not happening in the wild, right? But they do this with researchers, and so it brings out something within them, something that, again, natural law is a matter of inclinations, and we are not unique in what we show towards infants. Yeah.
Sorry to go off
Go ahead.
topic, but I thought I'd put this out there. I don't know if anybody here has seen, there's this guy that raised lion cubs from when they were young.
Oh
They're
yeah.
now like full-grown male lions,
Yeah.
and they play around with him and treat him like he's the leader of the pack, the guy.
And there's that
It's
famous video
interesting.
too of that guy who goes to Africa. Yeah. And everyone's thinking that the lion's going to eat him. And they said, the lions don't remember people. You don't go out there because we're not going to be responsible. And sure enough, he goes out there, and you see on the video the lion kind of like creeping up, and you're like, oh, this is going to be bad. And then it hugs him.
Yeah.
Because that again, part of a higher animal nature is this bonding that takes place. And that's just not just to do with instinct, but with emotion, with affection, with something that develops. The third thing that he talks about is an inclination to the good according to the nature of reason. What makes us distinctively human again? And each one of these takes a fairly determinate shape. So, you know, if you want to make this a little bit more specific, to continue in being, what can we derive from that? The inclination, or the precept, is that what belongs to the natural law? Whatever is a means of preserving human life, warding off obstacles. So the natural law says that you should respect life. human life in particular, because that is our kind. It doesn't necessarily say, well, screw all the other animals, do whatever you want to them. Thomas isn't saying that, but he is saying there's something distinctive about this. So when you see somebody, threatening another person, and you feel that that's wrong, that's because there's an inclination in you that is coming from, our being that's woven into us, and that inclination is right. When you want to help somebody who is sick, that's warding off whatever is, an obstacle to human life. Whatever is a means of preserving human life. What do we need to preserve our lives? What are our basic needs that we have? Food, yeah, food and shelter. Providing other people food and shelter, not just ourselves. You notice that this isn't just about our own self-preservation. This is about the preservation of other human beings. Providing other people with food and shelter when they don't have it is fulfilling the natural law. Depriving them of food or shelter would be against the natural law, wouldn't it? So going and burning somebody's house down is not just a bad thing because, you took away their property. It's a bad thing because you actually took away their shelter. As they sometimes say when they're being melodramatic, taking food out of my children's mouths. If somebody actually is doing that by, whatever they're doing in the workplace to somebody else, then they're violating the natural law. There are certain basic needs, certain basic things that the natural law says that everybody ought to be given. Can you think of any others? Food, shelter, medical care, perhaps? Yeah.
I was going to say air, but last class you said that we kind of just do it on our own.
I think you're right.
But it's...
Yeah, I think certain environmental things, access to water, could be a matter of the natural law as well. Clean air. Water, it's a big issue here being discussed in New York because of the fracking thing. Are they going to allow these chemicals to be driven underground to bring out other things, which may strip the water supply? That could be thought of in terms of the natural law. Let's move on to the next one. We have reproduction and raising young. So, what does the natural law actually tell us that we ought to do? We ought to, in fact, have sexual intercourse. Otherwise the species dies out, right? We have a natural instinct towards that. And the natural law would tell us it should be exercised in certain ways. For instance, sort of radical promiscuity, screwing anything that moves, would not be, fulfilling that instinct in a way in accordance with reason. I mean, just think, today, how many things could go wrong with that. Back in Thomas's time, they didn't have syphilis, let alone other PEDs. Syphilis is horrific by itself, but it's not as common as some of the other things that we have to worry about as well, right? Well, what are some of the other things that you'd have to worry about? Just go out and follow your sexual instinct wherever it happens to lead. Well, how could that go wrong?
Get a random girl pregnant.
Yeah. I mean,
kids will be
if you're going to have children, you should actually be prepared to take care of them. What else? Why else is it a bad idea to sleep with anybody who will possibly sleep with you? It's what? It's just gross? Well, yeah, I mean, if you set your bar very low, then it's probably not going to be that pleasurable. So let's say you actually add a proviso in there. Sleep with anybody who will sleep with you who you don't find gross. What else? It's still, why?
It's going overboard.
Okay, now again, you have a properly functioning faculty of reason that you're actually listening to, and it's recognizing certain inclinations. There's certain goods that you would deprive yourself of, and also, like you're making a good point, deprive other people of, by just indulging your sexual appetite indiscriminately. Raising children. What does raising children involve? I mean, that's something to think about with this too. Does that mean just showing up, putting food on the table, saying, all right, get to it? What do you have to do if you have kids? A lot of responsibility, isn't it? Something some people have to do.
Guide them.
How so?
Just teach them right from wrong.
That's a big one. I mean, if you're actually telling your kids, go and beat up the other kids and take their lunch money, you're not fulfilling the natural law. You're not raising your kids well, are you? Actually, that wouldn't fit over here, too. If you don't have teachers, then you have to teach your kids. I mean, we can actually farm out a lot of this child raising stuff to teachers and other people, daycare workers. If you're going to do that, you should probably actually check them out. I think these days, if you want to get to the nitty-gritty of this, the natural law would probably say you should have a good idea of what those in charge of your kids are actually doing with them, because the kids are ultimately your responsibility. What else do you have to do? Is it enough just to sort of like put up the guardrails? Yeah.
Nourish them?
Nourish them, yeah. You mean just food, or?
I guess food and make sure you have what they essentially need and like a
That-
house.
That's important too. What else should you give children though? Yeah. What's
I
that?
think he said it, yeah,
Love,
there you go.
yes. It's parents who don't love their children, and it's tough to love kids sometimes, actually. You know, quite frankly, it takes work sometimes. Parents who don't love their children are actually, in Thomas's view, violating the natural law. And if they thought about it, if reason was functioning well with them, they could figure out, hey, I'm screwing up. I need to fix this. I need to do things differently. Sometimes parents have those sort of moments of realization. And what would keep them from doing that? Well, think about if you're getting the wrong messages from society, if your passions are disordered, it's going to be much harder to love your children as you ought to. When we get to the even higher level, the distinctively human level, and I do want to say this is distinctively human too. We love our children in ways that horses and other animals don't. If we get to the higher level, where it has to do with reason, he says, there is in every person a natural inclination to act according to reason, and this is to act according to virtue. So we should, in fact, actually cultivate the virtues. If we speak of virtuous acts, then those are going to involve a lot of different applications of reason. What else, though? We have a natural inclination to do two other things that's really important. Two other things that are really distinctive to us human beings. One is to live in society. Now, we talked about this before. Other animals do have somewhat of a social organization. They don't debate about it. Dogs don't say, should we have a dictatorship or a democracy? What sort of rules should we make for this pack? They just sort of, do things. Bees, do incredibly interesting things. Actually, ants are even more complex. But ants don't sit down and say, is our society on the right track or not? The other thing that Thomas says, and this is where I'm going to lead you, because I'm actually holding you over a little bit, unfortunately, and I apologize for that, is to know about God. Thomas thinks that that's part of the natural law, that that's something distinctive to us. And there again, we're moving into this very theological dimension, so I think that's a good place to stop and to sort of wrap up the semester.